Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 790 for October 27th, 2019. Coming up in a few minutes.
Making whiskey is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And you just need to keep going, keep chugging away, right? Keep your eye on the quality. Make sure that you're making interesting and unique whiskeys, and make sure that people are still interested in what you're doing at the end of the day.
Doesn't sound much like an Irish whiskey distiller, right? Alex Chasko certainly is, though. When John Teeling sold his Cooley Distillery to Beam Suntory at the end of 2011, Chasko went along with John's sons, Jack and Stephen Teeling, to their fledgling Teeling Whiskey Company in Dublin. Today, the Oregon native is their master distiller, and the whiskeys he's been distilling are now starting to reach the market, along with the ones they built the Teeling Whiskey brand name on. We'll have more with Alex Chasko later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have your voice, the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and with Halloween this week, we'll have a ghost story on Behind the Label. It's all ahead on this edition of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
Let's get started with the news. It's brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. There's a new world record for the most expensive bottle of whiskey ever sold at auction, and even the auctioneers at Sotheby's didn't see this one coming. Last time around, we previewed the Sotheby's Ultimate Whiskey Collection auction that was held Thursday at London's Olympia, and the highlight was a 60-year-old 1926 Macallan from the Fine and Rare series. But this one was, so to speak, one of the ordinary 15 fine and rare bottles from that cask. There were a total of 40 produced. 12 each had special labels designed by either Sir Peter Blake or Valerio Adami, while one special bottle had a label hand-painted by artist Michael Dillon. That one was the one that set the previous world record last November at a Christie's auction at £1.2 million. And before Thursday's auction, Sotheby's thought this bottle might top out at around £450,000. After all, there are 14 other ones just like it out there. Well, they were off by £1 million or so. When the hammer came down, the final price was £1,452,000, or about $1,873,971. And Sotheby's spirits specialist Johnny Fowle thinks this record might just last for a while.
Everything about this auction, the fact that it was the first for Sotheby's, it was really the first big single owner in recent history, especially since the prices have soared so high. It was just such an important auction for collectors, for the UK sales and UK auctions or worldwide auctions for Sotheby's. It was huge for whiskey. And I think that the fact that this happened at this time, I don't think it will be met for a very long time.
Sotheby's is not releasing any details about the winning bidder, and Johnny Fowle says the anonymous American collector who sold off his collection was ecstatic. Every single bottle that went up on the block sold, with a final total of around $9.9 million, nearly double the pre-auction estimate.
I watched the first 1926 Macallans go on sale at Hong Kong, and I thought that was going to be one of the most exciting moments, and this auction just blew that out of the water. It wasn't just the results, it wasn't just the record on the Macallan 1926, the record on the Bowmore 1957, the record on the Bowmore Bouquet, the record on the Springback 1919, the record on the biggest the most expensive miniature of all time. It was just back to back, but it was also the fact that we had it in Olympia in London, which is a huge venue. It was full of 100 collectible cars. Our auction went just before RM Sotheby's, which is our motor car auction, and the room was packed full of people. There was so much bidding from the phone, live in the room, and online. I don't think it gets any better than that.
There were 178 different Macallan Fine and Rare Series bottlings on the block, along with 2 complete Macallan in Lalique 6 Pillars collection sets. Both of those sold for more than £600,000 each. A spokesman for the Macallan declined to comment on the auction results, except to say, quoting now, "It is a testament to the fine quality and consistent production process of the Macallan that collectors would seek out and pay for the privilege of obtaining such a fine dram." We'll have some of your reaction to the auction later in your voice. One other auction record fell this week. Whiskey.auction sold a rare miniature bottle of whiskey for a not-so-miniature price. The 50-milliliter bottle of Old Orkney Real Liqueur whiskey came from the old Stromness Distillery on Orkney and brought a winning bid of £4,000. That's around $5,130 at current exchange rates. It's believed to be the highest price ever paid for a whiskey miniature. And the next auction record that could fall may come in mid-November, when Bonhams will place a 30-year-old cask of the Macallan up for bids in Hong Kong on November 15th. The current record for a single cask of whiskey stands at $375,000, set by another 30-year-old cask of Macallan 2 years ago at a Spank auction in Hong Kong. The 1989 ex-sherry hogshead up for bids on the 15th has been stored at the distillery since it was filled. Bonhams has set its pre-sale estimate in a range from around $460,000 to nearly $600,000. In other news, we are now starting to see the first impacts of the new U.S. tariff on single malt whiskies from Scotland and Northern Ireland, and it involves the online auction market. ScotchWhiskeyAuctions.com announced this week that it will begin adding a 25% surcharge on all successful bids for those whiskeys from U.S. bidders to cover the cost of the tariff. In addition, shipping charges may go up since the U.S. government is requiring whiskeys covered by the tariff to be shipped separately from blended Scotch whiskeys or any other whiskeys not covered by the tariff. So far, none of the other major online retailers or auction sites have announced similar policy changes. Scotland's Strathern Distillery opened in 2013 and released its first single malt just a couple of months ago, where it was one of the top-ranked whiskies at the annual Whisky Fringe Festival, sponsored by Royal Mile Whiskies in Edinburgh. Now the distillery has been sold. Douglas Lang & Company announced Friday that it has acquired the Perthshire distillery. No purchase price was announced, nor did Strathern's founders give a reason for selling. It'll be the first distillery for Fred Lang and his family, which has been working on construction of the planned Clutha distillery that's being built as part of the new headquarters complex for Douglas Lang & Company in Glasgow. Strathern also produces gin and rum, and those brands will continue to be sold under new ownership. Turning now to new whiskeys, the Balvenie has unveiled the fifth and final series of bottlings in Maltmaster David Stewart's namesake DCS Compendium series. The final batch of bottlings is nicknamed Maltmaster's Indulgence and includes 5 whiskeys ranging from 16 to 56 years old. That last one is a 1962 vintage that is the oldest one ever released by the Balvenie. It dates back to David Stewart's first year at the distillery in 1962. Only 50 sets of Chapter 5 will be available worldwide. The price tag, $80,000 for the set. This will be a tough week for family, friends, and fans of the late Dave Pickerel, who died suddenly a year ago this Friday. His colleagues at Whistle Pig Rye are releasing the first edition of their Boss Hog Rye whiskey since his death, and it's being nicknamed the Samurai Scientist in honor of another distilling legend, Japan's Chokichi Takamine, who taught Americans about koji-style fermentation more than a century ago. The whiskey itself was distilled in Canada using koji fermentation and matured for 16 years before being finished in Saiku Umeshu barrels from the Kitaya Brewery in Japan. It's been bottled as a single barrel release, which means there will be slight variations between the 90 different barrels. The price tag, around $500 a bottle. The Glenlivet is coming out with something special for the U.S. market. No, there will not be any whiskey pods involved. Instead, there are 6 different single cask editions that will be available exclusively in California, Illinois, Florida, Massachusetts, New York, and Texas. The ages range from 14 to 17 years old. Retailers in California, New York, Texas, and Florida will each have a cask for their state, while Illinois and Massachusetts retailers will share 2 casks. The recommended retail prices will range between $270 and $300 apiece. India's Paul John Distillery is releasing a Christmas edition of its single malt in the U.S. for the first time. It's a lightly peated whiskey finished in Pedro Jimenez sherry casks. No word yet on pricing. Last time around, we mentioned the exceptional casks series of whiskeys from Aberfeldy and Craigellachie that are being released in the U.S. Got word this week of yet another Aberfeldy single cask from that series, destined for the global travel retail market. It's a 15-year-old single malt finished in an Oloroso sherry cask. It'll be exclusive to the Heinemann travel retail shops in Frankfurt, Hamburg, Amsterdam, Sydney, and 11 other airports worldwide. The price tag, around €100, about $111 a bottle. Back in 2011, Tomatin released its first edition of Decades to honor longtime distillery manager Douglas Campbell. Now, Decades 2, with a Roman numeral for the 2, is being released to reflect the distillery's 5 decades of recent history. Back in the 70s, Tomatin was cranking out 12 million liters of malt whiskey every year for blending purposes, but scaled back operations at that time to focus on quality instead of quantity. The 21 casks used in Decades 2 date as far back as 1973. 3,600 bottles will be available worldwide. The recommended retail price, £175, about $225 each. Other news and notes in brief. Iowa's Templeton Rye is releasing a new maple cask finish whiskey. It was finished in Templeton barrels that had been seasoned with maple syrup from Vermont. It's the first in a series of new barrel finishes coming from Templeton. Just a few days after being named the best international Irish whiskey bar again this year in the annual Irish Whiskey Awards, the founders of New York City's The Dead Rabbit are starting what could become a global expansion. Jack McGarry and Sean Muldoon opened The Dead Rabbit in Lower Manhattan's financial district back in 2013. They will be expanding with a second location in the French Quarter in New Orleans in 2020. Jack, Sean, and their backers are also looking at opening bars in other cities as well. We heard from Graham Cool last month on his departure from Glen Murray Distillery in Speyside to become master distiller at Ireland's Dingle Distillery. At least part of Graham's old job has been filled. Dr. Kirsty McCallum has joined Glen Murray owner La Martini Case as head of whiskey creation for Glen Murray, along with the Cutty Sark and Label 5 blended scotches. She leaves Distell, where she was the master blender for the Bunnahabhain, Deanston, Tobermory, and Lechig single malts, along with the Black Bottle blend. She'll be based at the Glen Turner Distillery in Bathgate. No word yet on her successor at Distell, or a new distillery manager at Glen Murray. And Johnny Walker master blender Dr. Jim Beveridge had some FaceTime Friday with Queen Elizabeth. Earlier this year, he was named to the Order of the British Empire in the Queen's Birthday Honors list. He received his medal from the Queen Friday in a ceremony at Windsor Castle. And we pass on our congratulations to the good doctor. You can keep up on the latest whiskey news all week long at WhiskyCast.com. The news is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Larceny Bourbon's heritage goes back to the days when Treasury agent John E. Fitzgerald was patrolling the rickhouses of Kentucky, not just for the feds, but also for himself. Mr. Fitzgerald was stealing a taste of some of his favorite barrels of wheated bourbon on the side, and today's award-winning Larceny Bourbon has that same soft, smooth character Fitzgerald loved. Look for Larceny Bourbon at 92 proof at your local retailer, and be on the lookout for the upcoming limited edition releases of Larceny Barrel Proof. Find out more at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Don't forget that the Whiskey Club of the Month becomes part of WhiskyCast next time around. We started honoring a whiskey club each month on our WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast several years ago. Now we're bringing it over to the big show. Each month we pick a whiskey club somewhere in the world to honor as our Club of the Month. They'll receive 24 WhiskyCast Glencairn glasses to use at their club tastings. And if you have a whiskey club, we'd love to hear from you, like we did this week from one of Australia's many whiskey clubs, the Whiskey Enthusiasts in Burnie, Tasmania. All you have to do is use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Tell us about your club, and if your club has a website, we'll be glad to add it to our growing list of whiskey clubs worldwide at whiskycast.com. We'll also put your club in the running to be honored as our Whiskey Club of the Month. It's supported by Glencairn Crystal. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. The Whiskey Extravaganza makes its annual stop in Seattle, Washington, Friday night, November 1st. I'll be at Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts this coming Saturday, the 2nd, for the American Single Malt Whiskey Seminar that afternoon and the Whiskey Roadshow that night. The folks at New York City's The Dead Rabbit are sponsoring their first New York Irish Whiskey Festival that night as well. Whiskey Live Johannesburg is November 6th through the 8th in South Africa. The Whiskey Exchange is hosting Brooke Laddie's Adam Hennett for a tasting on the 6th in London. McTeers has its next whiskey auction on the 8th in Glasgow, Scotland, just ahead of Glasgow's Whiskey Festival on the 9th. Virginia's Mount Vernon estate hosts the inaugural George Washington Whiskey Festival that same day, and the Scotch Malt Whiskey Society's U.S. chapter will be holding a release party for its latest American single malt whiskey release on the 11th. Here's a clue. It's being held at Balcones Distilling in Waco, Texas. Finally, the independent bottler Murray McDavid is hosting an open day on November 16th. You might ask, how does an independent bottler have an open day? Well, it's at the historic Dallas Dew Distillery Museum in Speyside. Right now, we have 149 different events around the world on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com, and we're always adding new events. If you have a whiskey festival, tasting, or any other whiskey-related event coming up, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to let us know about it, and we'll be glad to add it to the list.
The search never ends, but it's nice when you can come in for a landing, pause and explore the silky smoothness of Single Pot Still Irish Whiskey, matured in the finest bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. Land on Redbreast, then be sure to pass it on. Proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Mortlock. If you listen to Alex Chasko speak, you'd never guess he's one of Irish whiskey's rising stars. That's because Alex grew up in Portland, Oregon, but now makes his home in Dublin as the master distiller for Teeling Whiskey Company. When Jack and Stephen Teeling left their father's Cooley Whiskey Company behind after John Teeling sold it to Beam Suntory at the end of 2011, Alex Chasko went with them as they started their own company and eventually built their own distillery in Dublin's Newmarket Square. They built the Teeling reputation using casks they had acquired while at Cooley and started laying down their own whiskey 4 years ago. Earlier this year, one of their 24-year-old single casks was named the world's best single malt whiskey in Whiskey Magazine's annual World Whiskies Awards. I caught up with Alex Chasko recently after a tasting at Julio's Liquors in Massachusetts, where he showed off the new Teeling Single Pot Still Whiskey that will arrive in the U.S. after the holidays. After 3 preliminary tries to get the single pot still, you got the batch you wanted, right?
We did indeed. We got there in the end.
How'd you create it?
Well, it's a work in progress. It's A long effort. You know, that you're talking about something where we've been working on this whiskey for 8 years, with the location of the distillery, the equipment for the distillery, then the actual making of the whiskey, and then the aging of it, and the selection of the casks. It's been a labor of love, but it's been a long haul also.
But with the first 3 batches of Single Pot Still that you released in different regions over the last year or so, what did you learn from those 3 that went into the final official Single Pot Still release?
I think what we learned was quite simple, that people like the influence of sherry casks on Single Pot Still, right? But they also like the influence of the American oak on there. And so it was that balance between getting the sherry earthiness and the nose right from the sherry cask, along with the tannins and the body coming from the American virgin oak.
And this one will be coming to the U.S., right?
It will indeed. Yes, it'll be 1,000 cases that will be available on the 1st of January.
And it's already available in Ireland and all the other markets, right?
Of course. Yeah. For some reason, the U.S. is, I wouldn't say the last on the list, but there's always a lag time there between the rest of Europe and getting it over to the U.S.
It takes longer to fill those 750 bottles.
Yeah, well, that is part of it. Absolutely. Yeah.
I have to ask, how relieved are you guys to not have to deal with the tariffs, because they avoided the entire 20 southern counties? Yeah,
that is great. That was unexpected. We were expecting there to be something for Ireland in that, and I'm not sure if that's the Trump administration's lack of geography, or if that was intentional, or what, but we're happy to be the beneficiary of it. Yeah.
Let me get your origin story here, because we've never really had the chance to talk about this, because people don't think you're an Irish distiller, are you?
No, I'm not Irish. No, I'm originally from Portland, Oregon, and I would have started out in the craft beer world. So I was working at the Bridgeport Brewing Company in Portland, Oregon, and then from there I went up to the Pyramid Brewing Company in Seattle, and then eventually went over to Heriot-Watt University and got my master's degree in brewing and distilling, and had a brief hiatus running a brew pub in Singapore for a few years before eventually settling in Ireland. Yeah, and meeting up with the Teelings, and then working at the Cooley Distillery, and now the Teeling Whiskey Company.
And your wife is Irish.
My wife is Irish, yes. She's from Tipperary. So, yeah, that's the reason why we ended up in Ireland.
And that's how you get to live in Ireland and work in Ireland, and the rest of us are jealous.
Yes, that's the privilege that comes with falling in love with an Irish lass. Yeah, exactly.
What has been the best part of having your own place to play with in the Northern Liberties, as opposed to working at Cooley for all those early years?
Look, working at Cooley was a privilege and an honor, and a place where you could come into an existing distillery and say, oh, maybe we could do this, and oh, maybe we could do that, and what do you think of that? And, you know, you had the experience of Noel Sweeney and David Hines and the rest of the team there to bounce ideas off and to see what would work, right? The experience at Teeling has been twofold. One, that there is more freedom, but with that goes more responsibility also, right? So there's definitely more of it being on, I feel at least, more of it being on my shoulders as far as the production, right? And there is no one there saying, well, there are people that are saying no, but there's no one there saying no, right? So you have to kind of watch yourself and see, like, okay, is this really the right thing to do? I think I question myself more at the Teeling Whiskey Company than I would have at Cooley.
What did Noel and David teach you?
Lots of things. The whiskey making process, right, is relatively simple, but there is a art and a science and a complexity to it. And what I like about it is there's all these little nuggets, there's all these little bits that you pick up, and some of them are quite large lessons, right? And some of them are quite small. But the key, I think, is to try and hold on to them, and when you need it in the future, to be able to use that and to say, I remember Sweeney saying this, or I remember, somebody saying that to me in a previous conversation, and you know what? That's what we should do. Yeah.
A lot of distilleries have conflicts between the master distiller and the master blender. you get to do it all yourself. So do you argue with yourself over what you're going to do?
Absolutely. Yeah, I do argue with myself as to what we're going to do. With it being such a long, multi-stepped process, right? There are times where you think, oh, this will be great. And you make a whiskey and you put it away in the cask and you're expecting one thing. And what you get out the other end might not necessarily be what you were expecting in the first place. It's still a great whiskey, but it's just not what you were expecting. So I think the key is to embrace those unexpected surprises, right? And to try and keep your eye on the prize. Try and, keep going, keep chugging away, right? And accepting the limitations of where something is at the time, right? And embracing the successes when they come.
One of those successes was earlier this year with one of your 24-year-old single malts being named the world's best single malt. How big a surprise was that?
That was a very big surprise. It's something that we had been hoping for and targeting for quite a while, and to finally get it was a shock and an honor. Even sitting there at the table, there's little clues along the way, and you're sitting next to the chairman, and you're sitting at what appears to be the big table at the awards ceremony, and it's a clear shot from you to the podium, and you're thinking, oh, we might be in for something big here, right? Oh, I hope, right? But even up until the last minute, I wasn't 100% sure as to what was going to happen.
What did you think when they announced it?
It's just how brilliant it was that we'd done it, right? We'd achieved that goal, and that was something that a lot of people have been trying to achieve, and a lot of people will hope to achieve in the future. And to have our moment there was brilliant.
Now, that whiskey came from Cooley originally, correct?
Yes.
Tell me about the process of bringing your own single malt online and trying to make it live up to that reputation over the next few years, because the stuff you're distilling now is still a little ways away from being ready for a bottle yet, right?
Yeah, it's, an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing, at times concern and at times argument as to which way are we going to go and what is it going to be. And, you say things like the liquid will tell you and it's ready when it's ready. But, you're also going into the warehouse and seeing, okay, what's the story with this? And, sometimes you're more positive and optimistic on certain days than you would be on other days. So it's making whiskey is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And you just need to keep going, keep chugging away, right? Keep your eye on the quality. Make sure that you're making interesting and unique whiskeys, and make sure that people are still interested in what you're doing at the end of the day.
When do you think we might see the first Teeling single malt that comes from the Northern Liberties?
I hope it is very soon. I wouldn't put a date on it, but I am, well, I'll say this. I think that the single malt is in a better spot than the single pot still at the moment. And the single pot still I'm very happy with. So I have great hopes for the single malt.
Who gets the final say, you or Jack? His name is on the door.
His name is on the door. He's the guy that's paying the checks at the end of the day, right? It's a team effort. It's there's times where we're in agreement and absolutely on the same page, and there's times where we both are trying to make it the best that we can, and maybe have different views as to what that should be. But we, in the end, come to a consensus. There's an agreement. It's not just Jack and myself. There's a whole team of people that are involved in it, and it's really great to have that honor.
And Stephen is the kid brother that nobody wanted, right?
No, nobody wanted Stephen, right?
I kid, of course, but
of course.
He plays a key role.
He plays a very key role. Yes, actually, beyond just a little brother. Yes, Stephen Teeling is a key element of the Teeling Whiskey Company, of course.
You guys have really sort of helped revitalize that entire neighborhood in the Northern Liberties in Newmarket with the distillery, with having Daryl and the guys at DLD just down the street, and really trying to build up that whole community in the Liberties from what it was 10, 15 years ago, where it wasn't a great neighborhood.
Yeah, it was the part of Dublin that got looked over in the Celtic Tiger era, right? It was the part where it was on the list of areas to be developed, and the party ended before we got to build the buildings that were there. What is interesting with that is that that gave it the opportunity for the Teeling Whiskey Company to come in and to purchase that land. If it hadn't have been for the recession, oddly enough, the Teeling Whiskey Company wouldn't have been able to afford that site. So it's been great to see the building going on. There's times where the floor is shaking and the wall looks like it's coming down, and you're like, if those guys would stop doing that when building the building next door, it would be great. And there's other times where you're like, wow, there's a new coffee place next door. I'd like to go and see what that's about, right? So there's pluses and there's minuses with it, but I think the Liberties is such a great history. There's such a great characters coming out of it, and it's great to see it being revived.
Theoretically, you guys are going to be there for forever pretty much now, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. You don't build a distillery with the view of it being a short-term project, right? So, yeah, it's great to have the distillery there in the location of the family's previous efforts, and to be able to bring the Teeling name and the production of whiskey back to the Liberties, yeah.
Now, we always believe in fairness at WhiskyCast, so when Stephen Teeling turned up in New York City a few days later, I wanted to give him a chance to respond to Alex Chasko's comments.
Yeah, he obviously said that when I wasn't in the room, was it? Yeah. Man, I thought Alex was a friend. I thought my brother would say that rather than Alex, you know. He was obviously told by Jack to say that, you know. The little brother that nobody wanted. How do you respond to that, you know?
Look, he did acknowledge, though, that you were a very important part of the business.
That was very kind of him after insulting me to a group of people, probably. But yeah, it's all love. I think Alex is like part of the family at this stage, so he gets away with it. I probably annoyed him so much that he can say that, you know. But yeah, I suppose being part of the family business and being the younger brother, I have to put up with a lot, you know. I have to have a very, very long fuse and be very patient with older brothers and people like Alex as well. But yeah.
Especially when Alex is even bigger than I am, true, and he's big enough to break all of us in half.
True, but he is a gentle giant. So, you know, we were always hopeful he could help us with security and when people start talking out of line, but he is very much a gentle giant, unfortunately. So, yeah.
And you can't get him to play for the Teeling rugby team, huh?
No. That was part of the grand plan. So get him into the whiskey business, but more importantly, get him to play for Clontarf Rugby Club. But no, I think Alex is more a spectator and a drinker at the rugby rather than a participant. That's all good. It's all good.
Just a little family fun there. That's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Mortlach, whiskey's best-kept secret. Hidden away for decades in some of the world's most famous Scotch whiskies, comes a single malt inspired by an original for a fortunate few. Discover the entire Mortlach lineup at malts.com. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Let's start off with the 24-year-old Teeling single cask that won the World Whiskies Awards title earlier this year. It was matured for 21 years in an ex-bourbon barrel, with a final 3 years in a Sauterne wine cask, and bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is fruity and aromatic, with notes of green grapes and fresh berries, subtle touches of figs and dates in the background, and just a hint of dried flowers. The taste is thick, nectar-like, and tart with citrus fruits, white pepper, dried flowers, and hints of honey and vanilla. The finish is long, tart, and well-balanced with a nice fruitiness, and I'm scoring the Teeling 24-year-old Irish single malt whiskey a 94. I was in Tennessee this week as a guest of Diageo to visit the Cascade Hollow Distilling Company, which is where they make George Dickel Tennessee whiskey. I finally got a chance to taste the Dickel Barrel Select. There's no age statement on this one. It's bottled at 43% ABV. And the nose is delicate, soft, and mellow, with touches of dried flowers, lots of fruity sweetness, and just a hint of caramel. The taste has gentle, spicy notes of black pepper and allspice, balanced by a nice floral character, and sweeter notes of butterscotch and caramel candy. The finish, long and smooth with gentle spices and a nice sweetness. This one's a sipping whiskey that deserves more attention than it usually gets. I'm scoring the George Dickel Barrel Select a 92. And we'll have more from this week's trip to Tennessee next time around. I'll have more tasting notes for you in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. Rye whiskey was distilled by America's original risk-takers and history makers. Those first barrels of whiskey were bold, flavorful, and full of passion. Sagamore Spirit proudly picked up the torch with their spring-fed Maryland-style rye whiskey, celebrating the grit and glory of those patriotic ancestors who sipped their way into American history. Visit SagamoreSpirit.com to explore their award-winning spirit. Heaven Hill has released its third batch of Elijah Craig Barrel Select Bourbon for the year. Batch C919 is 12 years old, and it's the strongest one since early 2016, at a whopping 68.4% ABV. The nose has notes of pipe tobacco, molasses, brown sugar, and charred oak. The taste is thick, syrupy, and chewy, with a slow buildup of black pepper and clove spices, complemented by molasses, brown sugar, and a touch of oak tannins. Water opens up honey and vanilla notes on the palate while not diminishing the spices, and the finish is long and spicy with just a hint of oak. I'm scoring batch C919 of the Elijah Craig Barrel Select a 92. And full disclosure, Heaven Hill Distillery is a sponsor of WhiskyCast. You might remember that I was in Australia at the end of August, and I brought back a couple of bottles that are only available in that part of the world. Jim Beam makes a special small batch edition exclusively for sale in Australia and New Zealand that's blended with a bit of tawny. That's the Australian fortified wine that's very similar to port. It's bottled at 40% ABV, and it's likely to confuse someone who's expecting a more traditional bourbon. The nose has notes of red grapes and plums, brown sugar, and muted spices, along with honey and vanilla notes. The taste is fruity and spicy with red grapes, plums, figs, honey, and touches of ginger root and allspice. And the finish has a lingering sweetness with a hint of spice and a touch of licorice that shows up late to the party. It's an interesting take on Jim Beam. I'm scoring the Jim Beam small batch with tawny an 88. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Sagamore Spirit Rye Whiskey. I'll be adding these tasting notes to our searchable list of nearly 2,700 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com.
From deep in the north, far beyond the wall, the howl of the frozen wind brings word of something new. A whiskey from the land of always winter, for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
Let's open up the inbox now for Your Voice, presented by Lot 40. After we reported Thursday on the results of the Sotheby's auction and the record-breaking price for that bottle of the Macallan 1926, the comments came quickly on social media. John at WhiskeyCat1324 tweeted this: "So close, I thought I had it with £1,451,000. Flipping credit card limit," with a winking emoji. On Facebook, Gary McCall commented, "What fun it would be to drink that." But Aaron Keppel responded with this: "This bottle will never be cracked open. There is absolutely no way it can live up to that hype price." Mike Simpson added, "Madness. Pay all that to likely never drink it." Mario Campa responded with a single face-palming emoji. And Gareth Barton posted this note: That moment when you know the human race is doomed. Now, while some people are seeing this as a sign of the impending apocalypse, our friend Christos Koulizakis of London posted this comment on our Instagram feed. Let's see if the 2 million pound barrier is smashed before any slowdown or overheating appears. Good point, Christos. And if you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, look for us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WhiskyCast. You can also email us directly. The address is comments@whiskycast.com, or you can use the contact form at the website. Your voice is presented by Lot 40, Canada's 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Let's wrap things up now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and other things that all combine to make whiskey unique. It's brought to you by Writer's Tears. And since Halloween is coming up later this week, it's worth noting that a number of distilleries around the world have their own ghost stories. Some of them involve the ghosts of distillery workers who never left, in a spiritual sense. But the Pulteney Distillery in Wick, Scotland, got its ghosts the hard way. Distillery manager Malcolm Waring explains.
During the period from 1922 to 1951, when Pulteney was silent, it was owned by a gentleman from Edinburgh called Arthur Bennett. He leased the distillery out because he wasn't allowed to mature or distill because of a restrictive covenant put on the place. And he leased it to the council, and for quite a number of years the council used it as the morgue, currently where the visit centre is at present day. So hence the, more than one type of spirit at Pulteney, because we have friends there that we can't see.
You hear them occasionally, right?
I do hear them, yes. I'm not the only one. I've never seen anything or experienced on it other than you can hear them. If I'm upstairs on the office myself, I'll hear them downstairs, and vice versa. If I'm out the office and the girls are in the visitor centre, they'll hear something upstairs and I'm not there. So there's definitely something there.
And you're stone cold sober when this happens, right?
Perfectly sober, exactly. I'm not full of spirit, put it that way. No. You'll hear it any time of the day or night.
Probably Scotland's most famous distillery ghost no longer haunts either Glen Grant or the Glenrothes Distillery in Speyside. Biawe Makalaga came from what we know today as Zimbabwe in Africa, with Glen Grant owner Major James Grant as a young boy, and eventually became the Major's butler. After his death in 1972, he was buried in the cemetery on the hill that overlooks the Glenrothes Distillery, just down the road from Glen Grant. And as the story goes, a few years later, distillery workers saw what appeared to be a dark-skinned man emerging from the cemetery at night. Professor Cedric Wilson, who taught and studied pharmacology, as well as being fascinated by the paranormal, went to Makalaga's grave in the cemetery and claimed to speak with his spirit. Biawe was apparently upset over the recent installation of new stills at Glenrothes, but after his talk with the professor, he apparently rested. His spirit hasn't been seen in the 40 years since. But if you're around a distillery one night this week, be very quiet and listen. After all, you might just hear something. Maybe it's the angels coming for their share, or a spirit of a different kind. You never know. If you have something you'd like us to look at on Behind the Label, just use the contact form at whiskycast.com to get in touch with us. Behind the Label is brought to you by Writer's Tears.
Writer's Tears Copper Pot, a unique triple distilled premium Irish whiskey, combining single malt and single pot still. First fashioned in the 1700s and still a rarity today. Sure, as we say in Ireland, what's rare is wonderful. Writer's Tears Copper Pot.
That's all for this week's WhiskyCast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can find links for our WhiskyCast HD videos and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcast, along with the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, And of course, our complete archive of past episodes that dates back to 2005. In just a couple of weeks from now, we'll be celebrating our 14th anniversary and beginning the 15th year of WhiskyCast. We have some ideas in mind to celebrate the anniversary of Whiskey's longest-running podcast series, but we're always looking for more, so if you have an idea on how we can celebrate, let us know about it. You can always use the contact form at whiskycast.com, get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or you can email us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com.
When you land on something special, you just know. Redbreast, the quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey, and a proud sponsor of WhiskyCast.
From far beyond the wall comes a whiskey for those who face the oncoming storm and never stop walking. Winter is here. White Walker by Johnny Walker.
White Walker by Johnny Walker. Blended Scotch whiskey, 41.7% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2019, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.